right. Our next speaker is one of the rising stars in geroscience and my esteemed colleague at the Buck Institute, Dr. John Newman. He is a geriatrician and a scientist with his own lab, whose work focuses on the biology of aging and how it intersects with clinical care. His research on ketone metabolism, resilience, and cellular aging has helped shape the future of translational aging science. Today, Dr. Newman will explore the topic Geroscience and Geromedicine, examining how fundamental biology can guide us to new therapies that improve healthspan. Please welcome Dr. John Newman.
It's really exciting to bring this new science and this new approach to medicine to Mauritius. And I especially want to thank Damien Adam and Nadine Adam, whose vision and drive have made this possible, and echo what Damien said earlier, that this is not just a conference. We hope that this will be the start of real change in the lives and the health of every Mauritian, and in a way that sets an example for the entire rest of the world, including the United States, where I'm from. So thank you all for being here. As Brian said, I know that there are many clinicians in the audience, many doctors, many nurses. I am one of you. I'm a geriatrician. I take care of older adults, mostly in the hospital. But I'm also a basic scientist, studying the biology of aging, and I'm a clinical researcher, studying how to apply the biology of aging to the clinical problems that are important to my patients, and to try to understand how best to use the biology of aging to really improve the health and the lives of millions, maybe as Dr. Khan said, billions of people. I do have some relationships with industry, companies that I've been a scientific co-founder of. None of these relationships are relevant to what I'll be talking about for the next 30 minutes, though. I know that this is likely a new field, a new area of research for many of you, especially for the clinicians in the audience. And so I want to start with some basics. Basics I didn't learn in medical school, but have really shaped the way that I've approached the rest of my career, how best to take care of people and how to transform the care of older adults. Aging is a universal process. Aging happens to every single one of us, if we're so lucky. And aging happens across the lifespan. As Dr. Bischoff was saying, aging research is not just about older adults. Of course, I like older adults a lot. They're my favorite patients to care for. But aging research applies across the lifespan, and a longevity-focused, aging-focused approach to care applies across the lifespan. One of the best predictors, for example, of who's going to develop osteoporosis is to look at bone density when you're 20. One of the best predictors of who's going to develop sarcopenia and frailty when they're older is someone's muscle mass in their 30s and 40s. So aging is a lifelong process, and we can think about addressing it across the lifespan. Many of us are most familiar with aging as the primary, often the dominant risk factor for causing most of the chronic diseases that most affect the lives of our patients, and that we spend most of our time trying to treat and manage. I learned this in medical school, as all of you did. I also learned that aging is a non-modifiable risk factor. There's nothing that we can do about it, and so we didn't learn anything more about it. But as we'll talk about, as you've already heard, that's not entirely correct. Aging is not just about diseases, though. Aging drives how everything our patients experience affect their lives. My favorite example of this is the broken bone. Any orthopedists in the room? We're very, very good at fixing broken bones. But the broken bone is not the same in every person who experiences it. When my 24-year-old research assistant fell off of a skateboard and broke a bone in his arm, it didn't really affect his life in any meaningful way. He had a harder time working for a few weeks with pipetting in the laboratory, but he was just fine. But when an older adult, especially a frail older adult, falls and breaks a bone, it's the same pathology, it's a broken bone. We know how to fix that, but it affects their life in such a more dramatic way. And those of you who have cared for older adults who have fractured a femur, broken a hip in the hospital and afterwards, know that that's a life-changing event and can even be a life-ending event. An entirely different result from the same pathophysiology driven by aging. This is one of the most dramatic examples I can think of how aging affects everything to do with our health. And the most important thing that I'd like you all to remember is that aging is not a number. It's not the years elapsed since you were born, but aging is biology. I'll cut to the conclusions, so you can ignore the rest of this talk. But we now know that the impact of aging on health is driven by specific cellular and molecular processes that we can understand, we can study, and increasingly we can manipulate. These processes are modifiable. What I learned in medical school, that aging is a non-modifiable risk factor for chronic disease, for diabetes, for cardiovascular disease, for chronic kidney disease, is not entirely correct. Clinical trials and healthcare that target aging, this is no longer the realm of science fiction. This is actually happening around the world. And geromedicine is a path to better health for everyone. We'll talk more about that. What could be the impact of targeting aging to try to address the rising rates of chronic diseases like cardiovascular disease? Well, doctors, nurses, we spend a lot of our time managing traditional risk factors for cardiovascular disease, managing blood pressure, counseling patients to stop smoking, managing cholesterol, treating diabetes. These are all really, really important, and they can help lower risk, save lives. But when you put them on the same scale with the risk generated by aging, they almost vanish into nothing. If we could change just a tiny fraction of that risk added by aging, we could have more impact on health than all of the cholesterol management, blood pressure management that's ever been done. And the same with dementia and Alzheimer's disease. Diabetes, physical inactivity, your genetics, ApoE status, smoking, these are all important risk factors for Alzheimer's disease, but they fade into the axis when you put them on the same scale with the risk due to aging. And of course we all know this is true. 25-year-olds, regardless of their genetic makeup, don't get Alzheimer's disease, and 85-year-olds do. Because aging is the primary risk factor for so many different chronic diseases tend to happen together. Clinicians all know this. It's rare to meet a person who only has heart disease. They have heart disease, they have some kidney disease, they have diabetes too. This is not a coincidence, and it's not a probability of the passage of time since they were born, but it's because aging drives all of these diseases together. And so this generates the concept of multimorbidity, that this is the normal state for chronic disease. Chronic diseases go together. And a large part of geriatric medicine is learning to treat these chronic diseases as a coherent whole rather than individually. This is also why, as much as all of us would love to cure cancer, would love to cure cardiovascular disease, just curing one set of chronic diseases doesn't have as much of an impact on people's health as we would hope, because the person who gets cancer may get diabetes next year, may get chronic kidney disease the year after that, and may get Alzheimer's disease the year after that. The promise of geroscience is to get at the root cause of all of these conditions. And of course, aging has impacts on health beyond risk of disease. I talked in the beginning about how it impacts how a person responds to any change to their health. It's the prism or the processor through which health problems express to change the function and affect the independence of people. And there's also changes in organ function due to age that we don't call them diseases unless they get severe enough, but they still can affect people's lives, like the gradual loss of muscle mass that starts in our 30s and proceeds inexorably as we get older and older. So in all these ways, aging impacts health, and in all these ways may be modifiable. Because we can observe and measure aging at every stage of a person, from clinically, from measuring the overall state of their aging through things like frailty measures. We can look at the physiology of aging in individual organ systems, but increasingly, as you've heard today, we can also observe and measure aging at the cellular and molecular level, which can tell us what's going on with a person's entire body. You've seen the hallmarks of aging before from Dr. Kennedy, and I want to echo just how incredible this is, that we understand many of the cellular and molecular processes that drive how aging affects our health. And we can not only understand these, we can study them in the laboratory, we can manipulate them in the laboratory through genetics and increasingly through drugs, and as I'll talk about in just a couple of minutes, we are now at the stage of testing whether drugs and other interventions can manipulate these mechanisms of aging in people too. To help you kind of frame how to think about the biology of aging, I put these molecular mechanisms into three broad categories. One is that damage is inherent to life. In the same way that an old car will rust the longer you drive it, our mitochondria, for example, generate reactive oxygen species as an inevitable byproduct of living, and these glom onto our DNA and to our proteins. We gradually accumulate damage through our lives. But this is actually not the dominant factor that determines how we age. Rather, it's how we respond to that damage, how we respond to stress. The biggest difference between a mouse that lives 2 years and a human who might live 100 is not the rate at which we accumulate damage, but rather the rate at which we can repair it. And it turns out that these repair pathways not only determine differences between species, but they are often targetable genetically and by drugs. And so many of the most promising gerotherapeutics activate these repair pathways. And this has proven so far to be a very promising method to manipulate the biology of aging. And then finally, there's the consequences, big picture problems that grow out of smaller problems. When you have enough damage to your mitochondria that they stop producing energy, and so your cells can't repair damage anymore. When you accumulate senescent cells in your body or lose function of your stem cells. These are meta effects, broad consequences of aging, which can also be targeted therapeutically. I do want to say briefly, as a basic scientist, the value of basic science, which you've heard a little bit about today. These are worms. These are little tiny worms called C. elegans, which are about 2 millimeters long. They're everywhere in the world. They're almost too small to see. They live for about 2 weeks. Which of these worms is old? You can probably guess, right? The one at the bottom just looks like an old worm. It's kind of wrinkled. It doesn't look like it's moving as smoothly as the younger worms above. Worms age. And because worms only live for about 2 weeks, we can do sophisticated, large-scale biology on them, which we can't do on people. But how could we possibly learn something about how we age, how humans age, from a tiny 2-millimeter worm? Well, in San Francisco, at the University of California, San Francisco, one of my former faculty colleagues named Cynthia Kenyon set out to find genes in worms that regulate worm aging. And she found one by accident. It's a really cool story. I'd love to share with you over cocktails later. She found a gene that when with one change in that gene, it doubled how long a worm would live. It still actually has the record for the biggest difference in lifespan from a single gene change. Does anyone know what that gene is? It took a while to identify it. And it turned out it was the worm version of the insulin receptor. Insulin is kind of important to human health. When you look at centenarians, there's no single longevity gene, but centenarians most commonly have changes in the same pathways that make worms live longer too. So basic science can lead us in new directions. In the United States, there's also a national multi-center clinical trial network for mice to test compounds, drugs, to see if they can help a healthy animal live even longer. This has been running for about 15 years now, and there's about a dozen or so hits, drugs that extend the healthy lifespan of animals, of healthy animals, and many of these drugs are now entering human clinical trials. So this all leads us to the geroscience hypothesis, to the idea that interventions that target fundamental mechanisms of aging, because aging drives all of these health problems, will prevent, mitigate, or treat not just one disease, but many diseases at the same time, and help people to stay healthier longer. This is great, and our field has gotten very good at making worms live longer, and almost as good at making mice live longer. But how do we translate this into changes in human health? And here's where I'll give you my geriatrician's perspective, which we didn't coordinate these talks very well, but we're all saying more or less the same things in different ways, of practical ways that we can translate the biology of aging to improve health. It turns out that social interventions, we call these social determinants of health, where I work. Social determinants of health are not just determinants of health, they're determinants of aging. If you ask a cardiologist, what are some of the risk factors for cardiovascular disease? They'll list these things out: inactivity, poor nutrition, too much smoking, too much alcohol. If you ask a neurologist, what are the risk factors for Alzheimer's disease? They'll give the same list. If you ask an endocrinologist, what are the risk factors for type 2 diabetes? They'll give the same list. That's because these are really risk factors for aging. They affect cellular molecular pathways that drive risk in all of these different diseases. And we actually know that modifying these factors can affect aging broadly. So physical activity, nutrition, social connectiveness is really important to healthy aging, our sense of togetherness. A sense of purpose is really important to healthy aging. And you can measure these things, this is biology, you can measure these things at a cellular molecular level. And then there's geriatric care principles. One thing I've learned over the years is that good care for older adults is actually good care for everyone. Everyone wants to be cared for in similar ways. If I were to describe the geriatric approach to a patient, it's understanding the importance of treating them as a whole person, not as a collection of organs or a collection of diseases, but taking this integrative approach, accepting the complexity of someone with a complex life and a complex medical history, and trying to figure out how to best help them without causing harm in other areas. So good care for older adults, geriatric care principles, is good care for everyone, and this too works through biology. So for example, age-friendly hospitals, hospitals that are organized to provide the best care for older adults, also provide the best care for everyone, and help to prevent complications and help people to recover their independence. Mitigating polypharmacy, where medicines help, but too many medicines may do harm. Managing multimorbidity as an entity, rather than managing 6 or 7 different chronic diseases all separately. Focusing care on function, what's the big picture goal? Asking people, what is your goal for your medical care? What can I help you accomplish in life? But making sure that in treating a disease, we don't lose sight that our goal is actually to improve the health of the person, improve their function. A key focus on preventative care. It's so much more effective to prevent problems from happening than trying to fix them after they've already arisen. And advanced care planning as part of making sure that the care we're providing to people is what they want and what helps to meet their goals in life. So these are not just my ideas, and these are not ideas unique to geriatrics, but they've been incorporated into frameworks across the field of medicine. This is one example from cardiology, trying to integrate the idea of addressing social lifestyle factors called life's essential eights to cardiologists with geriatric care principles and how these all interact with the biology of aging. It's all through biology. There's a movement in the United States to create age-friendly health systems that focus on key principles that are better care for everyone, but especially for older adults. These are called the 4 M's, or sometimes the 5 M's, focusing on mobility, mentation, the right medications, and focusing on what matters to people. But these are frameworks that can be applied to other healthcare systems to improve their overall care of everyone, not just older adults. If you're going to really try to study how best to change the care and improve the health of people by applying lessons from longevity and geroscience and geromedicine, you need to be able to measure how well you're doing. Measure in ways that are quantifiable, but that are meaningful to a person's health, that are meaningful to the person, and ways that are flexible enough that you can take measurements that are meaningful, that are informative for a frail 70-year-old and also a healthy 35-year-old. We'll talk more about this concept of intrinsic capacity as the conference goes on, but intrinsic capacity provides a framework to do this. Intrinsic capacity is a global concept sponsored by the World Health Organization, which attempts to globally assess the totality of someone's health through a number of different domains, assessing their cognitive health, their mobility, their nutritional health, their psychological health, and their sensory health, and combining these into an integrated whole. It provides both a framework for designing interventions, but also a method for measuring, essentially measuring aging, but in a very functional and meaningful way. And you can measure intrinsic capacity across the lifespan. You can measure this in a healthy 35-year-old, and you can measure it in a frail 75-year-old using different methods. Intrinsic capacity gradually declines across the lifespan, and a key goal is to maintain or improve it to help people stay independent longer. Now, along with social interventions and geriatric care principles, you're starting to hear today about a third area of applying aging research to clinical practice, which are gerotherapeutic medicines. And I want to talk about this a little bit. We don't know that there are any gerotherapeutic medicines out there right now. There are no medicines that have regulatory indications, FDA indications for aging. But there are a number of drugs that in clinical trials have performed as you might expect a gerotherapeutic would perform. in terms of having efficacy on multiple chronic diseases that may only be related through mechanisms of aging and targeting mechanisms of aging in the laboratory. So we don't know that these are gerotherapeutics, but these are some of the candidates that are often talked about in this field. And you'll recognize that some of these are very widely used drugs. And they're drugs that have application in a number of different chronic conditions, along with new drugs that are being developed specifically to target aging mechanisms. But the fact that many of these candidate therapeutics are already approved and are already used to treat certain diseases of aging opens up interesting opportunities for trying to apply geroscience principles to care, even while we're waiting for new therapeutics to come out of the pipeline. So how might one think about using gerotherapeutics in a clinical context? Well, for existing drugs, maybe a piece of low-hanging fruit, something that would be relatively straightforward to apply, is to prioritize prescribing drugs with gerotherapeutic potential for the chronic diseases for which they're actually already indicated. So what drugs do you pick to prescribe to someone with diabetes? There are a lot of choices. For a long time, only one of those choices was shown to reduce mortality in people with type 2 diabetes, and that's metformin. Now, there are a number of other drugs that have been shown to also reduce mortality, but in some cases, reduce the incidence of cardiovascular events, slow the progression of kidney disease. In many cases, this is, we think, because they may be targeting mechanisms of aging, like SGLT2 inhibitors or GLP-1 receptor agonists. So one could adapt practice guidelines to prioritize, especially for people at risk of multiple chronic diseases, to prioritize prescribing potential gerotherapeutics among other choices that are all indicated for the disease that you're trying to treat. And some of the diseases for which these potential gerotherapeutics are indicated for include type 2 diabetes, heart failure, both reduced ejection fraction, and very fascinating to me, heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, an entirely different beast, pathophysiologically. Would love to chat about that over cocktails with someone. And chronic kidney disease, of course. That's a way to apply potential gerotherapeutics now, also in a way that can be studied and tested. Data can be collected to see if that improves outcomes for people with these chronic conditions. And then there's the future. It's a near future. This future is right on the horizon, where there will be regulatory approval for new indications that represent healthy aging as a totality. That probably sounds a little crazy to most of you, because how could you possibly run a clinical trial that targets aging or targets longevity? Are we going to run a 100-year clinical trial? Of course not. But we can actually select trial endpoints and indications that broadly represent the health effects of aging, but that allow one to run clinical trials in a feasible short-term way. And these are some of the examples that people in the field are currently thinking about. One set of examples are the geriatric syndromes, like frailty or sarcopenia. Another example is to seek an indication for multimorbidity as an entity. So rather than a drug to treat one disease, a drug to treat 3 or 4 different diseases, or to try to prevent 3 or 4 different diseases. And then age-associated decline in intrinsic capacity, taking that WHO concept for which there is a diagnostic code in ICD-11 and applying it as a drug indication. And I think this is likely to happen in the next 5 years. These trials could take the form of either relatively long-term, multi-year studies that try to slow the decline, slow the onset of chronic diseases, or gradually improve function. These might be called Healthspan trials on the left. Or they could be shorter-term studies. Think back to my broken bone example. Such a huge disparity in outcomes between younger people and older people when they break a bone. This is an example of losing resilience. And one could study gerotherapeutics in the context of resilience, trying to help people get through chemotherapy better, get through a surgery better, or recover from a broken bone better. And these can be clinical trial frameworks too. These clinical trials are already happening. This is one of the most exciting things that I want to share with you. Hundreds of clinical trials, mostly early stage, mostly about proving mechanism and testing feasibility, but hundreds of clinical trials involving potential gerotherapeutics have happened and are happening all over the world. And in fact, are supported by an increasing number of national networks to coordinate these clinical trials. One in the United States that's called the Translational Geroscience Network, paired with an education and training network that I'm one of the leaders for to teach investigators how to run these clinical trials. And then other networks like the brand new Canadian Translational Geroscience Network. There may be a similar network emerging in Europe soon and other parts of the world, just to emphasize how mainstream this research is becoming. How might this apply here to Mauritius? And why is the Buck Institute so excited about collaborating with Mauritius, and why am I so excited to be here? And what's in it for Mauritius? One thing I really want to emphasize is this is not me telling you my vision for what makes sense for Mauritius. All the ideas I'm talking to you about came from Mauritians, came from Nadine Adam and Damien Adam and others. And I think our job in the next few days is to work together to understand how we might customize and adapt these principles and these ideas to best suit the resources and the context and the conditions in Mauritius in a way that improves the lives of every Mauritian. What might be the outcomes? What's the promised hope? That a geroscience-geromedicine focused approach can delay and reduce the onset of major chronic diseases like diabetes and heart disease, can result in less disability due to aging, less acute hospital care as care moves from more reactive and acute in the hospital and more towards preventing these problems in the first place. All of which could result in a longer period of independent living. Independence. I love how Dr. Khan said, no matter where you go in the world, we ask people what they want out of aging research. They want independence. And more equity. This was alluded to earlier, but aging affects all of us. So who should be involved in aging research? Everybody. Everybody in the world. Who's likely to benefit from aging research? Everybody in the world. Who's likely to benefit most? Well, think back a moment to the risk factors, so to speak, for aging, particularly these social drivers, these risk factors. Things like poor nutrition, housing instability, poor physical activity. At the Buck Institute, we're working on a project to study aging in people experiencing homelessness in California. Now, you can't imagine a worse combination of social conditions than people who are experiencing homelessness. And we know that people experiencing homelessness are deeply accelerated in their clinical aging. They develop geriatric syndromes, falls, frailty, chronic diseases 20 or 30 years faster than the general population in California. And they die mostly of diseases of aging. They die of cancer. They die of heart attacks. Social interventions or these social drivers of health are such important social drivers of aging, and the people who are at most risk due to these social factors are probably those who stand to benefit the most from aging research. We know that many of these components work. There's nowhere in the world right now that is implying all of these different principles to improve the health of their population. There's actually very few places around the world that are even applying some of them. But we know that many of these components work. That, for example, by addressing social risks, you can improve cognition and reduce dementia risk a lot. We know that by implementation of age-friendly hospitals and geriatric-focused care, you can not just reduce the cost of acute hospital care, but you can dramatically reduce the cost of long-term care afterwards by keeping people independent. And a mixture of gerontologists and economists have estimated that delaying aging just a small amount, delaying aging versus treating individual diseases, could have an economic value in just the US of $7 trillion. Increasing the healthy life expectancy in the US by just 1 year would have a total economic benefit of $30 trillion. And scaled to a country of Mauritius' size, this is still an immense economic opportunity. So what might be a vision for what we can all talk about in the next 3 days? Well, if we can monitor people's health and aging, for example, by monitoring their intrinsic capacity, by measuring their function in ways that are meaningful and quantifiable and can help guide data-driven interventions. If we could implement elements of age-friendly health systems to improve the care of everyone, but especially older adults, to prevent complications and improve independence, applying data-driven social interventions to address those underlying risk factors that are often very accessible to change, And then applying gerotherapeutic interventions, maybe through prescribing certain drugs rather than other drugs, or running clinical trials with new compounds. But using that monitoring, that intrinsic capacity data to help learn, adapt, and improve in a very integrated way. And maybe not just improve the health of Mauritians, but create a model of healthy longevity that the entire world can follow. I hope that's the promise of this conference. Geroscience can transform health for everyone, and that's why we're all here. So thank you very much for your attention, and happy to take questions.
Thank you, John. I think we have time for one or two questions. Does health education or educating the people serve as the optimal health determinant to increase longevity?
Health education of people, of individuals, is a key component because, I think often people just don't quite grasp the importance of decisions that they're making early in life and throughout their life. And I think maybe working geroscience into that can help those conversations, can help with behavior change. Doing this or doing that. It's not just about this disease or that disease, but you are changing your biology. And if we do things a different way, we will change your biology in a way that keeps you healthier longer. But one thing I've also learned is that education is not enough. When you're designing intervention trials to try to implement changes in exercise patterns and physical activity and social connectiveness, education is often the control group. Education has to be paired, in order for it to be effective, with enabling change too. Enabling change at the level of the individual, or at the level of the community, or the level of the entire society. I think that is really, really critical to talk about.
That's fantastic. I don't want to steal the thunder of the next panel, but I do think it's an interesting question. How can smaller island nations like Mauritius collaborate with global institutions to become regional hubs for longevity research? So maybe not too deep, because we might cover it in the roadmap for Mauritius, but wondering what your thoughts are on that.
I think we will, and this will be a topic of conversation throughout the next 3 days. I think smaller countries like Mauritius can be models, as I said, for the entire world, especially if the country, if the government, if the healthcare system are all aligned in wanting to implement change like this, and do so in a way where you can study how it works in the entire population. You can not only be a model for how to make change really happen, but also generate the data on what works and what doesn't. A lot of the things I talked about, a lot of the things you'll hear about in the next 3 days are not going to work. Some of them will. Some of them will very, very well. How do we get the data to find out which ones are most important? Implementing change in a country like Mauritius, I think, could generate that data that could inform what the rest of the world does.
Oh, fantastic. Everyone, please join me in thanking John Newman. Thank you.
Thank you.